To the Puritan mind, social health, a society where God will, according to John Winthrop, quote, delight to dwell among us as his own people and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, required individuals to question the physical world, to heed the authority of Puritan church leaders, live collectively, and to always remain alert to the threat of sin. These requirements many times created contradictions. The sense of duty to keep vigilance over society and self, the external and internal worlds, would direct the Puritan community into the Salem witch trials at their worst. Puritan courts accused many men and women of witchcraft and condemned 20 to death. By 1706, the tragedy of these sentences became public when one of the original witnesses who had testified against accused witches admitted she had been driven by the devil to lie. On the more liberal extreme, this sense of duty to keep vigilance over external and internal worlds led the Puritan New England leader Cotton Mather to endorse smallpox inoculation in 1723. He viewed this knowledge that the English had learned from Native Americans as a sign of the, quote, compassion of heaven toward a miserable world. Mather described those Englishmen and women who declined the inoculation of smallpox as opponents of God and hence satanic. Mather's contempt for the superstition of his critics showed a different side of the Puritans, a side that was forward-thinking and opposed to tradition for the sake of tradition. Both these sides, the superstitious, witch-hunting Puritan and forward-thinking, inoculating Puritan, were connected. Puritan's search for God, his truth manifested in the physical world, was part of the battle to stamp out evil. Puritans viewed themselves as surrounded on all sides by enemies. In this paranoid struggle, like in all total wars, the constant vigilance to avoid falling into sin sometimes led Puritans on a positive path to reform. Other times, it blinded Puritans to the harm they inflicted on others. Protestantism in England was initially a superficial affair. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and aunt to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. They did not produce a male heir, and Henry sued for divorce. The Pope declined the request, and Henry severed English relations with the Catholic Church. From marriage to divorce, more than 20 years lapsed. It was a complicated situation for Henry and a humiliating one for Catherine. By 1934, however, Henry had established himself as supreme head of the Anglican or Church of England, and like so, the Reformation arrived to England. Many of the followers of Martin Luther would have been disappointed at the changes Henry made. Henry's censure of Martin Luther's ideas demonstrated his religious conservatism and anti-Protestantism. For Henry, making himself head of the Anglican Church was just a means to his divorce from Catherine. Anglican rituals and scriptural interpretations remain overwhelmingly Catholic. From a top-down view, Protestantism gained spiritual momentum with the reign of Mary I, or Bloody Mary. She was the daughter of the novella union between Henry and Catherine. Mary resented her father for abandoning her mother. That he confiscated all the English properties from the papacy and declared himself supreme leader over them added to her indignation. Her resentment climaxed when her daddy finally had a son, Edward VI, from his fourth wife, and Henry made him heir to the throne. The half-siblings existed on friendly terms until 1547 when Henry died. Edward disapproved of Mary's devotion to Catholicism, and Mary condemned Edward's policies to reforming the Anglican Church in more fundamental ways. When Edward died unexpectedly in 1553, Mary had confidence that God intended her to correct all the wrongs that her brother and father committed on Christianity in England. Edward had opposed Mary as his successor, but she declared to her subjects, quote, "I am Henry VIII's daughter," and Catholics and Protestants supported her coronation. Mary became Queen of England at 37 years of age. She married King Philip II of Spain and began her campaign of Catholic justice, a counter-reformation by whatever means necessary. Her marriage to a Spanish monarch who symbolized the worst excesses of Catholicism made English subjects uneasy. Her aggressive purging of English heretics triggered resistance on the ground, even among fellow Catholics. It was during her reign that many of England's wealthier Protestants found refuge abroad and discovered the religious ideas of John Calvin. Calvin preached a faith where the individual's love for God alone directed his actions. He advised his followers, quote, "The pious mind restrains itself from sinning not out of dread of punishment alone, but because it loves and reveres God as Father. It worships and adores Him as Lord. Even if there were no hell, it would still shudder at offending Him alone." End quote. This was a theological school that demanded believers should live unobstructed by rituals and penalties. The sole reward in doing good was the good done. The individual trekked the path of God for perfect love. Calvinism, then as an ideology, pushed men and women to be self-motivated. Ministers encouraged individuals to reason and initiate change, not as reaction or because of fear, but to initiate change for self-improvement of the individual soul and also for the benefit of society. Calvin ridiculed the miserable men who, quote, "in seeking God do not rise above themselves as they should, but measure God by the yardstick of their own cardinal stupidity, their traditions and superstition, and neglect sound investigation. They do not therefore apprehend God as He offers Himself, but imagine Him as they have fashioned Him in their presumption." To discover God as He is, a believer had to better him and herself. They had to unravel the dynamics of the physical world as it was and is. The past provided little guidance in this endeavor. People had to examine the original stuff of life. Calvinism granted individuals a license to learn and question. Such stress on investigation made the concept of intellectual freedom godly. Calvin praised the liberal arts. Quote, "Men who have either quaffed or even tasted the liberal arts penetrate with their aid far more deeply into the secrets of divine wisdom. God's providence shows itself more explicitly when one observes the motion of stars to determine their assigned stations, to measure their intervals, to note their properties. So the mind must rise to a somewhat higher level to look upon His glory." End quote. The English Reformation that the Puritans introduced to England during the Elizabethan age intersected with the scientific revolutions in astronomy, geography, medicine, and many of these religious reformers interpreted these discoveries as a window into God's mind. When these radical Protestants returned to England after their re-education in the theology of John Calvin, Elizabeth I was the Protestant queen. Elizabeth was Henry's daughter with Anne Boleyn, his second wife. But even this liberal monarch thought the Puritans' intellectual will to discover God obnoxious and hard to handle. She passed laws against Puritans to assure their allegiance to the crown. Puritans were to, quote, "humbly confess and acknowledge I have grievously offended God in condemning Her Majesty's godly and lawful government and authority by absenting myself from church and from hearing divine service contrary to the godly laws and statutes of this realm." End quote. The Puritans played hooky from Anglican services, and they arrogantly and openly expressed contempt for the religion of the Queen. Even after Elizabeth passed these laws, the Puritans did not always comply. They believed without question that God revealed His truth to the righteous. They treated men and women outside Puritan circles with scorn. For many Puritans, such laws imposed by kings and queens underlined that if they were to remain God's chosen, they would have to stand their political grounds. During the reigns of Henry I and Charles I, the monarchy targeted directly Puritan transgressions. Both kings increased the power of the crown at the expense of religious tolerance. In 1598, James I, in The True Law of a Free Monarchy, had declared, quote, "A good king, although he be above the law, will subject and frame the actions thereto for example's sake to his subjects, and of his own free will, but not as subject or bound thereto." This idea that the English king was above the law, James' successor Charles, by wresting power from Parliament, would establish as an institutional reality. In England, Puritans had earned their political power. They had not always inherited it. They were educated property owners, and though many may have lacked aristocratic purity, by their professions they still achieved control over the flow of money and ideas. Many of them sat in Parliament and resisted Charles' enactment to increase taxes, enhance the power of his army, and the presence of the Anglican Church. The king refused to tolerate the insubordination of Parliament, and from 1629 to 1640 he ruled without a parliamentary branch. Missing representation and harassed for their radical theology, Puritans began to migrate in mass numbers in 1630 to North America in search of an asylum from this tyranny. Puritan extremism resulted from the combination of religious oppression and toleration that compelled English politics during the 16th and 17th centuries. The Puritans believed they persevered by their faith, ever so adamant that God was on their side even as they confronted diminishing political power and increasing persecution. But faith alone would not have helped them. The Atlantic and the new territory that welcomed them energized their determination that they were on the side of right. New England would offer the Puritans more religious toleration than Elizabeth's reign could have granted them. The retreat to New England was strategic. In Massachusetts, Puritans continued to cherish and yearn for the mother country. What the geography of America presented to these settlers was a fortified post to strengthen their forces and reanimate the world with their greater and better political, cultural, and social ways. In 1702, Cotton Mather asked in his History of New England whether it was to be a, quote, resting place or only a hiding place for those reformed churches to perfect their people, the elect of God. Mather suggested it was the latter, and the little accomplishment they had achieved so far in New England was a means, Mather hoped, to the greater accomplishment of having the outmost parts of the earth for Jesus' possession. The history of New England and the neighbors it spawned was the history of the struggle to carry out these theological, political, military ends. The vacancy of the land they entered further affirmed that God struggled alongside them toward the end of victory against the English crown. Of course, God's hand had nothing to do with it. It was the diseases that Europeans had been introducing since 1492 that transformed native villages into ghost towns. It was an eerie experience. One Massachusetts settler observed, "Fields rich in soil had been abandoned in the late great mortality which fell in all these parts about 3 years before the coming of the English." European disease traveled the routes of Native American traders, so that once the contagion commenced, it did not need the physical presence of European men and women to reach the places far away from Spanish, English, or French settlements. Yet even though these English guests acknowledged the role of disease in the demise of the indigenous people, they lacked knowledge of the source of this death and the reasons. What was clear was the abundance of resources at their disposal. Their theology was the lens by which they understood the benefits and tragedies of the world they traveled to escape their homeland. John Winthrop, who led the first wave of Puritan settlers across the Atlantic and served as governor of Massachusetts, noted, quote, "God has consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby the greater part of the country is left void of inhabitants." End quote. North American territory was sacred to the Puritans because they viewed it as a direct gift to them from God. The biological crisis they witnessed Indians endure only reinforced this sense of election, that God chose the Puritans to establish a world fit for the second coming of Christ. This biological crisis also triggered the Puritans to argue based on their observations that natives' political, social, and cultural ways were primitive and inferior. This belief in the inferiority of indigenous Americans served as the foundation to the argument that the territories the Puritans occupied were more their possession than the possession of their hosts, who originally occupied the land. John Winthrop distinguished between a people's natural right and civil right to territory. The former, he explained, was the means to possess land, quote, when men held the earth in common, every man sowing and feeding where he pleased, end quote. Winthrop insisted these methods of territorial possession were obsolete. According to this interpretation, the Puritans were more productive with the land. This productivity granted them a civil right to the land. Such rationalization would instigate the Pequot Wars in 1637 and King Philip's War in 1676. It encouraged undiplomatic relations, even if certain individual Puritans worked to be diplomatic, with the Wampanoag and Narragansett people of Massachusetts. Metacomet, called by the English King Philip, had been the son of Massasoit, a Wampanoag leader who had existed peacefully with the Pilgrims of Plymouth colony. The Pilgrims arrived in 1620 to the area and shared with the Puritans certain Calvinist beliefs, but disagreed on their relation with the Church of England. By the 1670s, a number of bad business and diplomatic deals, Wampanoag impatience with English livestock wandering into their land, resentment toward Christian evangelization, and the execution of 3 Wampanoags for the murder of a Christian Indian triggered a war. In King Philip's War, the English and the Wampanoag fought dirty. Both sides murdered women and children and tortured their enemies. Still, Increase Mather would write, quote, that the heathen people among whom we live lacked a right to the land because Lord God of our fathers has given to us for a rightful possession, end quote. Puritans rarely wavered from the belief that God elected them. They were determined that they were the warriors of God on earth. All these so-called godly gifts added to the pressures of migrating to new lands. The Puritans believed that God would take, if they diverted from his path, as easily as he gave. Of course, for a people as self-centered as the Puritans were, failure took on new proportions. Winthrop stressed that if his flock did not succeed at their mission, the whole world would fall into chaos. It was on the shoulders of these settlers that the salvation of all humanity weighed. In his model of Christian charity sermon, which Winthrop read in 1630 while aboard the ship Arbella, Winthrop cautioned, quote, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God and his work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. End quote. He preached an ideology that demanded of followers to remain conscious that the rest of the world watched, and that God intended the Puritans to serve as an example of godly being. Failure to lead on such terms would result in nothing less than the triumph of the antithesis of God, the Antichrist. If Puritans appeared dull, uptight, and morbid to outsiders, the ordeal they perceived they were living through made them so. When tragedy struck the Puritan communities, their initial instinct was almost always to blame individuals among the community who authorities or neighbors suspected of faltering from the teachings of Christ. In Increase Mather's interpretation of the causes of King Philip's War in 1676, he laid fault for the violent attacks of the Wampanoag on the second and third generation of Puritans who failed to follow, quote, the blessed design of their fathers in following the Lord into his wilderness, end quote. Mather further pushed the idea of godly punishment on Puritans for transgressing the original mission of the colony by emphasizing, quote, that the Indians did most unrighteously begin a quarrel, end quote. Since the Wampanoag never had been provoked according to Mather, most Puritans would have recognized that it had been God that drove the hand of Metacomet and his people to murder God's elected people and destroy their property. Ironically, Mather maintained that for the acts of terror committed by the Wampanoag and their allies, they remained nevertheless guilty. In fact, even when indigenous people behaved hospitable to the English, many Puritans perceived that God caused the Indians to help us. The Puritan stress on investigation certainly made the concept of intellectual freedom godly. However, when Puritans turned the guns of intellectual freedom on other Calvinists, intellectual freedom became a source of social disorder. In England, the limits that King Charles set on Parliament and all opponents of the crown hid the diverse degrees of radicalism among the Puritans. This diversity in opinion and interpretation resulted from the importance that Puritans placed on education. By 1647, the Puritans passed laws where authorities demanded villages of 50 or more families to have a teacher among them, and in villages of 100 or more, officials required a schoolhouse that provided lessons in Greek and Latin. This duty to be literate had a religious purpose, since it was one chief project of Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures. In Puritan love of knowledge lay the seeds for factionalism. Across the Atlantic in New England, separated from the immediate threat of a common enemy, the king, differences of opinion surfaced and became more conspicuous. One way to defend the community from such freedom of opinions was by making all Puritans responsible for the sins of other Puritans. This created a society of busybodies. At least it would have appeared so to outsiders. Most Puritans across social ranks yielded to this culture of surveillance. In Massachusetts, leaders like John Winthrop, with the consent of the people they represented, worked to assure the godly order of their community. The tight-knit family was at the foundation of this. Family members constantly supervised one another. No one remained immune to observation and criticism from any misdeeds. Thus, the family served as ground zero for intervention to maintain social order. Puritan leaders encouraged all people to marry. To live outside of wedlock suggested religious depravity, God's disapproval for some personal disgrace. Puritans waited longer than many of their contemporary Europeans to wed, usually in their late 20s. Still, 94 to 98% of people eventually entered matrimony. Those individuals who failed to tie the knot, the law still expected to live in family units. One man whom authorities discovered lived, quote, in a house by himself, contrary to the law of the country, was instructed he remove and settle himself in some orderly family in the town, and be subject to the orderly rules of family government, end quote. The prediction was that such solitude, detached from family organization, would make him subject to much sin and inequity. These laws intended to protect individuals from sin and contain degeneracy within the community. Family units had an obligation to remain vigilant also against neighboring families who slipped into disorder. In fact, the Puritans had the equivalent of social service officials who the government authorized to drop in regularly to ascertain that all was right. Civil leaders expected husbands to respect their wives. Physical and verbal abuse the law condemned. In families that the law defined as disorderly for a wide range of sins, officials moved children and servants to adopting families who were to provide the proper care. The care taken to maintain order in New England had its limits. Puritan society was not immune to dissent. In fact, their respect for education probably encouraged it more than in other forms of social organization where literacy was a privilege of the rich. Roger Williams reached Massachusetts with his wife in 1631. He had the respect of many Massachusetts leaders who spoke highly of him. Williams, however, refused to be a minister in Boston. He condemned religious leaders there for still recognizing the Anglican Church. He relocated to Plymouth, where his interactions with the Narragansett people led him to the conclusion that, quote, God made of one blood all of mankind, end quote. For his strange opinions, Williams was criticized. Officials, however, continued to hold him in high regard. By 1633, while serving as a minister in Salem, Massachusetts, William began discussing openly the problems of biblical interpretation. He preached to his followers that different Christians interpreted God's words differently, and that this did not imply that some were bad Christians. It only meant that God's truth reached each individual differently. Such theological reasoning went against the more conservative order that many Puritan leaders worked to ensure. Officials granted Williams various opportunities to modify his public views, but Williams, remained adamant in his beliefs that leaders of government had no right to limit intellectual freedom. For his radical beliefs, officials would vanish Williams. He would establish his own colony in Rhode Island, where he promised fellow settlers the liberty of conscience. In 1635, Anne Hutchinson, the wife of a prosperous merchant, began to hold meetings in her home where she offered novel interpretations of the Bible to other women. She questioned the idea of blaming Eve for original sin. When Anne Hutchinson was brought to trial for preaching to the lesser sex about female empowerment, she cautioned John Winthrop, quote, "You have power over my body, but the Lord Jesus has power over my body and soul. And assure yourselves thus much, you do as much as in you lies to put the Lord Jesus Christ from you. And if you go on in this course you begin, you will bring a curse upon you and your posterity, and the mouth of the Lord has spoken it." End quote. In terms of maintaining social harmony between males and females, the importance Puritans placed on being literate and on discovering the world created crises within their colonies. As Hutchinson made so clear to Winthrop, he had no control over her mind, which was captive solely to the truth God revealed to her. The more officials limited individuals' intellectual freedom, according to Hutchinson and Williams, the greater leaps Winthrop took in the opposite direction of Christ. However, for Winthrop, he had to limit freedom of speech to keep his community from fragmenting. And so Hutchinson, like Williams, was vanished. Oftentimes, the Puritans' quest for order resulted in scientific achievements, as in the example of Cotton Mather advocating smallpox inoculation. We witness these sparks of enlightenment too when they criticized the Spanish and French missionaries, in contrast to the English, for having ignored the knowledge the Indians possessed of medicine. Quote, "None of them was so kind to the world as to have kept a catalogue of the distempers they found the savages capable of curing, and their method of cure, which might have been of some advantage to our materia medica at home." End quote. We can earn a better understanding of their openness to knowledge as the underside to their savage condemnation of the people they accused of heresy by looking at how Puritans treated criminals. As the Puritans struggled to better understand the physical world, they similarly looked to better understand the internal reasons for social transgressions. In 1680, a servant woman gave birth to baby twins, which she had out of wedlock. She killed the newborns. Puritan church leaders discovered her transgression. She went on trial, and the judges sentenced her to death. Before her execution, however, she spent some 6 months under religious training to save her soul. The source of all crimes in Puritan society was original sin. One Puritan leader declared sin was what, quote, "the hearts of all men are by nature full of, and is a fountain that is always sending forth its bitter streams." End quote. The motive for the mother's crime mattered less to the Puritan condemning her than that all people possessed original sin and committed little sins that led to bigger ones, including infanticide. This woman's crime served as a lesson for all to learn from. In the execution sermons, Puritan officials recited the crime committed by this mother was one shared by the entire community. The entire community was guilty of the murder of the twin babies because they had the potential to kill unless they remained vigilant of their sinful characters. Thus, Puritans did not exile criminals from salvation for crimes, serious or not, so long as the criminal repented. Reverend Thomas Hooker declared, quote, "It is one thing to say sin is thus and thus, another to see it to be such. We must look wisely and steadily upon our distempers, look sin in the face and discern it to the full." End quote. Indian attacks, disease, and even murder of Puritans by Puritans were remnants of the original sin that had grown out of proportion. To acknowledge this sin and transcend it was to find God and achieve a type of control over the material world. Another preacher warned followers, quote, "The falling into sin is just cause of shame, but 'tis no shame to confess it, but a lasting shame not to confess it." End quote. Whatever wrong the Puritans committed or befell them was the result of their degenerate character. It was natural. For the Puritans, understanding the nature of their sinful ways was more important than the sin because it was knowledge. This knowledge was important to the sinner for purposes of self-awareness, and it was important to officials for purposes of monitoring social order. The motives driving Puritans across the Atlantic was not material wealth. At least their rhetoric does not suggest so. It was salvation earned by the meticulous examination of the world God made. The path that they braved for forgiveness sometimes led them to smallpox inoculation, gender or social equality, and other times to mad witch hunts, exiling free thinkers, torturing of native people, and executions. The Puritan desire to dominate was one perhaps that allowed more freedoms than others. Their form of domination was to serve as a model to the world, be a city upon a hill. But when the world refused to follow the model Puritans engineered, forward-thinking Puritans experienced a metamorphosis into witch hunters and despotic rulers.